Everyone, welcome to another developer group session from Kitchener Developer Group. Today we have Michel from Google, and he's going to talk about his trigger framework and how we can use that framework for any Salesforce automation. Quick introduction about myself. My name is Sudipta Deb. I am a Salesforce independent technical architect, Salesforce platform champion. This is my blog. I am 12x Salesforce certified. I'm having 400 plus trailed badges, and this is my Twitter handle. So without any further delay, I would like to hand over this to Mitchell.
Cool. So thank you everybody for attending. My name is Mitch Spano. I'm an application engineer at Google, and I've been asked to share a presentation that I've given a couple of times in the past about orchestrating all of your Salesforce automation with what I'm calling the trigger actions framework. So we'll be going through this presentation. I don't think any of us are going to be making purchasing decisions, but just in case I happen to talk about something that's not available on the platform and you happen to be buying licenses, make sure that you make your purchasing decisions based off of what's currently available on the platform. Okay, cool. So speakers is just going to be me today. Like I said, my name is Mitch Spano. I'm an application engineer at Google. I've been working in Salesforce since 2013. Fresh out of undergrad, this is kind of my first job, and I've stuck with it and made it into my entire career. So I've been involved in a lot of different projects, and I'm really excited to share this particular presentation with you because what I'm about to talk about today would have been applicable on all of my previous projects. So here are some things that you might want to take from today's presentation. Right? So if you happen to be an architect, I want you to consider how implementing this as your trigger framework of choice might help your organization grow and scale, especially as you manage multiple different teams. There's also some really cool stuff in this framework which will allow you to partition your trigger functionality or partition your application logic so you can be better prepared to utilize some new things on the platform, such as like second generation packaging. If you're a developer, I want you to consider how implementing a framework like this might allow you to deliver a lot higher quality code faster in your organization. And then take a look at some of the testing techniques that we're going to be talking about. There's some pretty cool stuff in this framework, which can speed up the execution of your Apex test drastically. And then if you happen to be a manager, or maybe you are a strong administrator who's looking to learn more about code, you might gain a little bit of understanding about some of the complexities that people face when they have to write triggers after attending this session. So you'll have a little bit better understanding of like what it means when a teammate says, hey, we need to write this new trigger logic, right? What does that actually entail and why it can be tricky sometimes? And then again, manager, like imagine how you can use this in a multiple team environment. We'll be talking about that later in the presentation. Okay, so Apex triggers, right? A little bit of background about Apex triggers. Salesforce is all about process automation, right? You have multiple different tools in different tiers of complexity and power that can allow you to enable these record-based process automations to support your customers or your business users. So you have workflow, which is kind of the old legacy. It's been around forever, and it's useful for updating fields on records or sending out email alerts. Process Builder was introduced a few years back, and Process Builder allows you to do more complicated workflow-like tasks. And then there's Flow, which there's been a lot of investment in Flow on the platform as of late. So there's a lot of great things that you can do with Flow that would have traditionally been done with Process Builder or Workflow. And then at the top, in terms of power, there is Apex triggers. Right now, at least Apex triggers are the most powerful thing that we have access to as developers and administrators to make Salesforce operate the way that we want. But with each one of these different tools, there comes another level of risk, right? If you want to author some trigger logic, you're going to need a developer to write it. You're going to need a developer to maintain it. And it kind of decreases the value proposition of Salesforce as a whole, right? They say you don't need to write code. So, you know, we want to be able to write triggers because they're super powerful, but we want to decrease the risk and the overall cost of maintenance for writing triggers. So triggers, you know, like I said, they can get kind of messy, right? So you kind of have your object and your context. So like on opportunity, after insert. Then you group all of your records based on some field values or which fields have changed. And then you might take some records on those collections of records. So after we insert an opportunity, if the record type is wholesale, maybe we'll notify some sales group, right? Send them an email, or maybe we'll update some related. But we always kind of do these same things, right? We always specify our context, determine which records are eligible, and then we take some actions on them. Now, in the existing trigger frameworks, right, we're oftentimes granted this mechanism by which we can extend a trigger handler and then override whatever context specific method that we need to do. So for example, for after insert, we can override the after insert method, and then we can insert, then we can have these private methods that do our trigger handling. So like handle wholesale insert or handle retail insert, right? And if you take a look, like if I were to go into an org and they had triggers that were written like this is very well written. You know, these one-liners, they give you a clear definition of what is the order of execution. They have like a descriptive enough method call name where you can kind of figure out what's going on. But like this is really great. But the problem is that no matter what, as new automation gets introduced into the org, right, the scope of these methods just keeps growing and growing and growing, right? So no matter what, you're going to have to come back in and modify the opportunity trigger handler if you want to implement some new features or functionality. There's also a couple of other things that are a little bit less than ideal about the existing frameworks, right? So for example, if I wanted to actually test this logic and cover it in an Apex test class, I really need to insert an opportunity to get it to be passed to the trigger.new variable and then have it flow through. And when I'm actually doing that, I'm not really writing a unit test. The unit test is supposed to be just for the scope of the method, right? I'm really writing an integration test because I'm also testing that like my validation rules were passed, that all the process builders, they got kicked off, all the workflow rules got kicked off, all the flows got kicked off. So it's really difficult to isolate exactly what you're trying to test in like a pure unit test driven testing mindset. All right. So I'm going to introduce you all to what I'm calling the Apex Trigger Actions Framework. So historically, we've had Apex classes that grant us a mechanism where we can like extend the trigger handler class and then implement our logic that way. What I've done here is I've extended that to utilize metadata as well to give us a lot more flexibility than we're traditionally used to. So right here is a QR code for the GitHub repository. And we'll be going over this repository throughout the course of this presentation. We'll be particularly checking out the README, but it's here in the presentation. You can take a screenshot of this if you'd like. And I'll share with you the architecture diagram for this trigger framework, right? So there's 3 real main classes that do all the heavy lifting, and then there's 2 different custom metadata types. We won't go into detail. The trigger base handles all of the dispatching of the regular trigger stuff. The metadata trigger handler casts what you've configured into the right objects and then calls their correct method as specified in the trigger action interfaces. So the whole point of this is it's kind of confusing, right? Like we don't want to have to worry about how the trigger base and the metadata trigger handler and the trigger action, we don't want to have to worry about that at all. And you guys as developers, if you implement this framework, you won't have to. The idea of this is once you have all this, it's just there and you can use it by authoring an individual class which implements the correct interface. Then we use custom metadata to specify on this context, on this object, in this order, I want to execute the logic that's defined in this particular class. So with that being said, I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio Code. All right. Now we've got, let me see here. So I'm on, let me blow up the screen a little bit so it's a little easier to read. So I'm on the master branch of the Apex Trigger Actions framework, right? And I've created a scratch org, and I'm going to push all of this stuff to the scratch org. Now, we took the contents of the repository and then we added a couple of changes. So if you take a look at the whole, let me see here, file mismatch, TA opportunities, stage, insert rules. Okay, so we have the whole trigger actions framework here. Oh, what's going on? Unexpected file. And all that we've done is we added a one-liner trigger on opportunity, and we wrote an individual class. What's going on here? Both the source must specify the metadata file. One moment here while I figure out what's going on. We don't actually even need to do it from Visual Studio Code. Let's go like this. So let's just deploy the framework. I'm sorry, I don't know what's going on with my scratch right here. Okay, here's the scratch org. Let's see if everything got pushed. Doesn't look like it. What's going on here? Both must specify both the source name and the metadata file. All right, let's retry these. Okay. Okay, cool. So the trigger actions framework has been deployed to the scratch org, right? And I'll do the development in dev console so we can see just what we're doing. I'll blow this up a little bit. So the trigger actions framework is now deployed into our scratch org. So, but there's a couple of things that we need to do before we can use it. So the first thing is we need to write a one-liner trigger on whatever object we want. So for opportunity, let's go here and we'll write a one-liner trigger. The trigger just operates on all context, and we just say new metadata trigger handler dot run. Okay. Now what we can do is we'll author an individual class that implements the correct interface. Okay. And I don't have a constants class quite yet, so what we're doing now is, this is pretty simple. This is limited in scope. So we write this individual class, and what it says is, we're going to go through every single opportunity that we're inserting before insert. And if the stage name is not equal to prospecting, we're going to add this error to the opportunity. Okay. So you write an individual class, and then there's an additional step. So we've installed the framework, we write the one-liner trigger, and then you write your class. Now you have to configure some custom metadata, and we'll determine how this is to be called and in which order on which object. So there's two different metadata types. there's the S object trigger setting, which holds the S objects themselves. So let's create a new record, right, for opportunity. If you are working with objects that are in a third-party package, you can just enter in the namespace here. So this will work with any installed package as well. And this just holds the settings for the opportunity itself. So now that we've written that one-line trigger and enabled this metadata record, now we've truly enabled the trigger actions framework on the opportunity S object. And you'll see at the metadata level, we have these, they're empty right now, but these related lists before insert, before update, after update. And you'll see how these get populated in just a moment. So we have this individual class. What we do is we take the name of the class that we've authored. We go back to custom metadata types. And we'll create a new trigger action. So trigger action, I'm just going to give it the same label as the Apex class name. Then you specify this is going to be the first thing that happens before insert, which is a metadata relationship to the S object trigger setting. And we're going to say this is the first thing that happens before insert on opportunity. So if I try to save this, I'll get an error because it says you must enter a description for this trigger action. So no longer can your developers just write code without telling other people what it's going to do. So prevents opportunities from prevents ops from being inserted unless stage name equals prospecting. All right. So now we can take a look back and we see at the related list level that we have all of the actions on the individual opportunity itself, the object opportunity. So if we go to opportunities, right, let's open this up in a new tab. And we try to insert one. So this is, my op, right? I'm gonna say it closes today. And let's just say that I try to do it in close one right away. I'm gonna press save, and you'll see the stage name must be prospecting when an opportunity is inserted. So what have we done here, right? We enabled the trigger actions framework by installing by pulling what's from the repository and pushing that to our scratch order. We wrote a one-liner trigger, and then we had that one, S object setting metadata itself. And then we wrote an individual class and used the trigger action metadata to basically call that class. So now if we set this to prospecting, stage name must be prospecting. Do we spell prospecting incorrectly? Oh, we added an extra dash. So we'll save that. Save it. There we go. Now we're able to insert the opportunity. Right. So those updates from your trigger, from your individual trigger action class will happen in real time, and there's no need to modify the metadata. So one thing that's cool about this is we never went in and modified opportunity trigger handler at all. We just wrote this individual class. So the next time we need to write another individual class, we can just write a new class. So let's write a new class, TA opportunity. We'll say this name hello. So what we do is TA opportunity name hello. What we say is we specify what interfaces does it implement. So this is going to implement before insert. So string hello equals hello. Right? For all the opportunities, right? Op name equals hello. Right? So now we've written another individual trigger action. Right? What we do is we take the Apex class name, we'll go back into the custom metadata types, right? We'll create a new trigger action for the name hello, set the Apex class name to that. We'll say that that's the second thing that happens before insert on opportunity sets the name to hello. All right, so now we saved it. Again, we take a look back at the parent S object trigger setting. We'll see we got this nice related list view of everything that's going on. So first, we prevent the opportunity from being inserted unless the stage name equals prospect. Then we give the opportunity the default name of hello. So let's take a look at opportunities, create a new one, give it a name of my op, right? We'll set the close date to today. We'll try to insert it in qualification, press save. All right, stage name must be prospecting when an opportunity is created. All right, great. So we put it in prospecting. It should go save and then go through, and then the name gets set to hello by default for us. So the act of extending your trigger handler itself is no longer a burden to your developers. Your developers no longer need to worry about other logic within the trigger handler. All of the maintenance that comes when you're trying to keep your triggers, architecturally sound and control the order of execution, you don't need to keep all of that complexity in one file, the one trigger handler to rule them all. You now can split out your individual actions into small classes and then use the custom metadata to determine the order of execution of those classes. So I'm going to take a pause here. I'm curious, do we have any questions in the chat, or do you have any questions? You can just speak up if you're curious about what are the moving parts, setting up the metadata, the installation process.
I don't see any question here, but you shared the GitHub link, right?
Yes. Let me share that again. Got the little zoom bar on top. Let me share this in the chat. Participants. The chat. Here's the chat. There you
go. Perfect. Yep. We got the link. Yeah. Nope, we don't have any more questions. But yeah, you can go ahead. I think this is one question that I was having, like, what is the GitHub link? I want to try that framework as soon as possible.
Yeah. Sorry, we got off to a little bit of a rocky start there with the Scratchler. But yeah, you just download, you take whatever is in the master branch, install it in your org, and then you can just build from on top of there. It should be super simple.
Hey, Amish, we got one question here. The question is like, are future methods possible with this framework?
Yeah. So if you had an individual action, let's just say after you update an opportunity, you need to make a call out to another system, right? That's a very common future method. And what you can do is you write your individual action, and then your individual action then would just would call a future method in its own class. Pretty simple.
Okay, I think that's good.
Cool. There are a couple other things I want to show you about this. There's actually a lot of other things I want to show you. I want to be sensitive about time because we do only have a little bit of time. So one thing that's really nice about this framework, right? So let's just say the name hello. You can see we've got this bypass execution checkbox. If you check this and save it, it will bypass the execution for that individual trigger action itself, or you can do it at the S object level. So this at the S object level is basically like turning the trigger off, whereas here it's like turning this individual action. So we turned off the defaulting of the name to hello. So let's try to create a new opportunity. My second op, that closes today. We'll put it in qualification. Staging must be prospecting. So we know that the prospecting one's still active, but when it is inserted in prospecting, we still see the name of my second op. We bypass the defaulting of that name, right? So that's one type of bypass that's possible with this trigger action framework, right? So let's go back and we'll turn that back on. So there's a second type of bypass that's available, right? So I could go into developer console, right? Oh, I guess I already have developer console open. Let's create a new opportunity. Let's give it a name. All right, let's give it a close date. Okay, and let's give it a stage name. Oops, qualification. All right, cool. So now, if we execute this anonymously, this should fail because the stage name's not prospect. Stage name must be prospect when an opportunity is good. All right, cool. So if you want to bypass that stage name check, you can bypass statically via Apex, right? So you can say metadata trigger handler. That's that right. You say metadata trigger handler bypass. Oops. And then you pass in the name of whatever you want to bypass. So you want to bypass the insert rules. So now this is a static bypass, meaning that it will stay bypassed for the rest of the transaction. So I should be able to insert this opportunity now because we bypassed the stage insert rules that force us to insert it with prospecting as the stage name. So you can bypass at the individual action level using metadata trigger handler.bypass. You also can say, you also can do at the whole object level. So trigger base.bypass opportunity, right? Should do the same thing. It'll bypass all actions on this. So if we did ID is the MyOp ID. Right. So if we bypass everything, we should see that the name is going to be my opportunity, and the stage name is qualification. So if we take a look at the log that just ran for that, and we see what we debugged, the name is my opportunity and the stage is qualification. So there's a second way which we can bypass using trigger base.bypass or metadata trigger handler.bypass. If you want to clear those bypasses whenever you're done, you can just use the clear bypass as well. So trigger base.clear bypass. Oops. So you can clear all of the bypasses or clear the bypass for an individual S object, right? And there's also the same corresponding static bypass mechanism in metadata trigger handler. So you can clear all of the bypassed individual actions or a specific bypassed action. So these are super nice for if you just want to bypass something statically for the scope of a transaction. The checkboxes are really nice if you want to bypass something kind of globally until you turn it back on. And then there's a third kind of bypass. I won't demo it, but I'll just give you a little bit of a description. You see on the object, on the S object trigger setting, there is required permission and there's bypass permission. There's also corresponding fields on the individual actions themselves. So required and bypass permission, right? And what these do is the bypass permission. So what you do is you enter in an API name of a custom permission. And then if the running user has that custom permission, execution will be bypassed for that running user. So this is super helpful for if you have like a data integration user, for example, and they are just not supposed to run any automation. They're just supposed to dump data into the system. You can just write a bypass custom permission, assign it to that user, and then they'll be good to go. The other one is called required permission. So this is kind of the opposite. So if this field has a value, you enter in the value of like the API name of a custom permission, then this trigger or this triggered action will only execute if the running user has that specified permission. So this is super helpful for if you're doing like a beta test of new features. You want to roll it out to a subset of your users, or you have a certain group of users that have some extra process automation, but eventually it's going to get rolled out to all users. You can give those individual users a permission, roll it out to them, and then when it gets rolled out to all users, you remove the required permission that you've specified on the trigger setting or the trigger action itself. So 3 different types of bypasses on the trigger actions framework itself. Should be more than flexible enough to give you exactly what you need.
And I think the third one is like, someone was asking about the same question, how we can do for a specific user, like an integration user. So that should be the third answer.
Yep. The integration user would be able to do this. I'm going to go through an example that I have in the README real quickly about testing, because you'll see when we make these method calls, right, we're passing in a list called new list or old list, if we're depending on the context that we have. But you know how I was talking about how earlier, if we wanted to test the logic, I'd need to insert the record. Here, since we have this public interface that we're implementing where we pass in the objects that we want, we can do something that's pretty cool that most folks have probably never even thought about doing. And we can test the logic for our trigger without actually inserting any records, right? So included in the trigger actions framework is a small class called the test utility. It's got a method called getFakeID. What you do is you give it an S-object type, say schema.account.SObject type, and then it will return to you a syntactically correct fake record ID. So you can assign that record ID to an account and you won't get an invalid ID runtime error. But then you can use that ID to populate what your new list and your old list look like. So we'll create the new list, we'll create the old list, we'll create a fake record ID. We'll say that the old version of the opportunity had stage name of qualification, and the new version of that opportunity had stage name of closed won. Then you can call your trigger action method itself, and your logic will execute, but you don't necessarily have to insert the record. So if you're just doing something simple, like you're adding an error to a record, you can just assert that the element in position 0 of the new list has errors. It's got exactly 1 error, and the error is the invalid stage change error from qualification directly to closed won. So you can fake out or basically mock your unit tests, so you don't even need to insert the records at all. And this can drastically save a ton of time when you're actually unit testing things. When you're running your unit test during deployment, we all are familiar with that little green circle that's got to go all the way around, right? So this can decrease the amount of time that it takes for those tests to run. You still cover your logic. It's not a silver bullet. It's not a guaranteed going to work for all scenarios, but just one tool to have in your reservoir that you can use in order to decrease test execution time and limit the scope of what you're actually writing in a unit test to be much more precise and decrease opportunities for other unwarranted failures that would otherwise cause your unit testing. So when I started writing the trigger actions framework, do you have any questions right here? Any strategies for handling governor limits, right? So what happens if you have multiple queries, right? So for example, on opportunity, you might need to query the parent account, right? Well, there's an example in the documentation. If you take a look, there's a section called avoid repeated queries. This is just a sample, but what we do is we use the singleton pattern to hold all of our queries, right? So we create a class called opportunity queries. Then we have an inner class that implements the action itself, and it populates this map of ID to account. And we specify that query to be the first thing that runs. And then you can use the singleton pattern to get the instance of the singleton, and then you have all of those query results for you in subsequent actions. So we make the queries, and then we can standardize the data using the result of those queries. You could use a similar strategy if you have multiple different actions, which on opportunities say update the parent account. maybe you hold you use the singleton pattern, or you hold a static map of ID to account for the parent accounts that you're going to update, and then have that the update of that be the final action which you. So most of the time you should be covered. How about a single DML after all trigger actions? Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. If you hold a static list or a static map of ID to whatever type of mess object you want, you have that be the final action which executes. That would be an applicable way to solve that problem. But we do have an example of how to do it with queries. DMLs would just be the same thing, just at the bottom, if you really want to. Most of the time, you should be okay. Most of the time, you're not going to have like too many actions that modify the same parent records. And if you do, you might be able to collapse some of those actions into one action. So that way you're performing all of your parent record automation in one. But we do have some tools in the toolbox to help address those warranted concerns about DML and SOCL limits. So I started writing the trigger framework at the end of last summer. I shared it with Twin Cities Developer User Group, which is where I'm from Minneapolis. I live in Austin, Texas now, but I'm from Minneapolis. And I shared it with a bunch of my old colleagues, and a friend of mine, he said, Mitch, this is awesome, but I'm curious if you could make this work with flows. So I didn't have it quite solved right then, but I'm really excited to share this with you. I've got to be conscious about our time, but you can use the trigger actions framework to write flows and then control the order of execution of your flows in relation to your apex. So you could say flow, apex, apex, flow, flow, and you can get that granular level of control over the order of execution, which we've never had access to before if you use the trigger actions framework. So I'm going to go over an example of how do we write a flow that does that. So let's go to flows. And this might be a little bit of a learning step from folks who are admins who are running flows, because these flows are going to be operating on a collection of records instead of an individual one. But you need to write your action or your flows in a certain way. So you choose an auto-launched flow. I'll go free form on this one. And what you need is, depending on the context that you're in, you create a new resource. It's going to be a variable, and I'm going to call it new list. Now, the API name has to be new list for this one, or old list if you want the old list, depending on which context you want to run this flow in, right? And this is a record collection of type opportunity, right? That's available for input to the flow. So when we specify our flows in this way, what's going to happen is the trigger.new variable is going to get dynamically injected at the flows instantiation into new list. So that way we can use it however we want to. So what I'll do then is I'll go, let's go like this. Let's go, the first thing that we need to do is we need to make a loop over all of the elements. So for each record that is in the new list from first to last, right? That's going to be the first step of our loop. What we're going to do is we're going to assign, so set the name to goodbye. So what we're going to do is the current record's name equals a new resource. That's going to be a constant. API name is goodbye, data type is text, and the value is goodbye. Okay. So we loop over all records and we assign their name to goodbye. Now there's one final assignment that has to work if you want to be operating in the before insert or before update context. You need to assign these variables back to a collection that represents the new list after the flow is complete. So we add to new list, right? So we're going to create a new resource, which is a variable. It's going to be called new list after flow. And this API name of the variable is particular, and this is what allows it to be plugged into the trigger actions. So this is a record collection of opportunities, right? And it's available for output. Okay. So for the new list after flow, so after the flow is completed, we're going to add the current item. So here's our flow. For each record, we set the name to goodbye, and then we add it to the new list when the flow is complete. Okay. So we write our flows so that way they operate on collections of records, and then we can save and activate our flows. So we'll call this the goodbye flow. Goodbye flow, right? Save it. Now activate it. Okay, so now this flow is active, but we don't have anything that's going to kick it off. It's an auto launch flow, and that's where the trigger actions framework comes in. So let's take a look back here at the setup menu. We'll go to custom metadata types. We'll create a new trigger action, right? We're gonna call this goodbye flow. What we do is we pass in the flow name to the flow name argument. And let's just say that this is the third thing that happens before insert on opportunity. Set name to goodbye, right? And what we do is Apex class name. If we put in some bogus Apex class name on this particular one, it's going to say, hey, wait a second, the name must be trigger action flow if you're using flow. Okay, so this is how we enforce that the flow will work, right? So press save. So now let's take a look on our opportunity, right? We're going to be prevented from inserting if the staging is not equal to prospecting. Then Apex will set the name to hello, and then a flow will set the name to goodbye. So if I go to opportunities, let's create a new one. My op, right? Closes today. Stage name qualification should fail. All right, that's great. Stage name is prospecting. It's going to pass that check. It's going to get set to hello, and then the flow is going to override it what's value and set it to goodbye. So we can write our flows and then control the order of execution of our flows directly within the trigger actions framework itself. And you get all of those custom bypass mechanisms which we just talked about too. So if I want to turn this flow off, I can just turn it off with a bypass execution, or I could specify it's got a required or a bypass permission. Also, there's another thing here. So let's go back into developer console. We'll open up that execute anonymous window. Oh shoot, we just lost it. You can also say trigger action flow dot bypass, and you pass in the flow name. So you can bypass your flows from Apex, right? There's also an Apex action where you can bypass Apex, a trigger, or a flow from flow. So, right, so the bypass type must be Apex if you're bypassing an individual action. It must be object if you're bypassing a whole trigger, or it must be flow if you're bypassing a flow. So constant, we'll call this is object, right? Data type is text, object. There we go. And the object's name is a new constant that we call opportunity. So you can then use this Apex action in any flow to bypass other triggered actions, other flows, or completely bypass all triggered things on that given S object itself. There's also a corresponding clear bypass Apex action to do that as well. So this works great. This is like a super helpful way for you to bridge that gap between your admins and your developers, because your developers need that control over the order of execution, right? You really need to be able to see like what is going on in the org, and this related list view gives you that. And the fact that this related list contains both Apex actions plus flow actions really means that like your manager can just come in and read this, and they don't need to re-architect the whole application in order to understand the automation on the opportunity assumptions. So this is super powerful stuff. There's one other Apex action which I want to show you guys. So let's go into flow. Let's create a new flow. I'll leave that one as it was. So let's create a new flow. So that was great for auto launch flows. Any tips on how to transition existing triggers and flows into this framework? So the flows is going to be a non-negligible amount of work. The existing triggers. What I do is I just write an individual action that calls the existing trigger. And then as time goes on, you pull out those individual actions from the legacy trigger action into their own individual ones. I've had a lot of success doing that. It's actually pretty easy to do. But one thing that kind of stinks about auto launch flows is that they don't have the ability to check prior value or is change. But there's a solution in the trigger actions framework for that. So let's go to new resource, a variable called new list, right? And let's just say that's a record collection of opportunities that's available for input. Okay, we'll create a new variable that's called old list, right? That's a record collection of opportunities, right? That's available for input. Okay, now what I'll do is, so let's just say we're going to write this flow, and what it's going to do is it's going to check on an opportunity, did the stage name change? And if so, we'll set a default description. So this is going to happen before insert on opportunity, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to loop over. So for each record, right? That is in the new list, right? What we'll do is I'll create a new resource that's going to be a variable. It's going to be the old record, right? What we need is the old value of the record, like the before value, or the value, excuse me, that's in the old list and the old map. So this is going to be a record variable. It's not a collection, but it's an individual opportunity. And we don't need to say it's available for input or output. But what we do now is, so for each record, we're going to call an Apex action, right? Called, let me see here, should be get old record for the trigger action flow, right? So the object for this is, these are all opportunity objects. So you set this up. Now the input values, what's the current record that you're on? Well, that's just the current record for each list. Whoops. Right? The old list, that's just the old list. What this is going to do is it's going to call some Apex that'll find the old value, the old version of that record in the old list and return it to you. And then you can assign that value to your old record variable. So old record is an opportunity, and it's going to get assigned the output of the get old record action. So now we have our old record, right? So we have our old record. Let's make a decision, right? Did the stage change? Right? If the stage changed, right, we'll know that because the old record's stage name will not equal the current record's stage name. If the stage has changed, right, then we know. And if that's true, let's set a default description. Okay, so we'll set the current record's description to a new resource, which is a constant. It's going to be text, right? The API name of the variable is description, right? And we'll say trigger actions are cool. Okay. So now we have the ability to say, okay, if the stage changed, now we'll set the default description. Now again, because we're in the before insert context, right? We need to add to the new list after the flow is complete. Now this is an important step, right? So we have a new resource, which is a variable called new list after flow, right? It is a record collection of opportunities that is available for output. And what we're going to do is we're going to add the current record to it. So Now we have to do that as the final step for every record in our loop, right? So even if the stage didn't change, you still need to do that. So let's draw this out a little bit. Let's gain some clarity over what we're doing. For each record, we're getting the old version of the record, right? If the stage changed, then we're going to set a default description. And then no matter what, to complete our loop, we add back to the new list after the flow is complete. Okay, so I press save. We'll call this the description flow. Right? I'll copy this flow's API name, save it. I'll activate it. We'll go back to custom metadata types. Let's create a new trigger action. Call it the description flow. Trigger action flow. It's going to be the first thing that happens before update on opportunity. And what does it do if the stage has changed? Set a default description. So now this is going to be the first thing that happens before update on opportunity. We take a look back. Our related list shows us everything that's going on in the system. So we'll go back to our goodbye opportunity, right? So I can edit this opportunity and I can give it whatever description I want, right? Now we know that the description is saved because it's still there. But if I modify the stage name, we should see the description gets automatically updated for us because the stage name has changed. So we can use the trigger actions framework in after flows, in before flows, and still write back to the parent record, and in update flows, and we can still use that apex action, getting the old record, to allow us to determine which field values have changed over this transaction, and then take our actions accordingly. All of the same bypass mechanisms are all the exact same, right? So you can bypass the flows, you can bypass apex, you can bypass the object. You can do it for an individual user using permissions. You can do it globally with the checkboxes. You can do it from apex. You can do it from flows. There's a lot of flexibility with this framework. I'm going to go back to the presentation because I know that we're kind of close to time. I want to talk about working together in multiple teams, right? So first thing that I would say is, now that you have a partitioning mechanism to partition your logic, I'd recommend taking a look at the SFDX project JSON structure itself. You can use this to partition what would otherwise be the contents of Force App into individual application directories, and you could then use that to partition your logic. So you might have like a base directory that contains trigger frameworks, HTTP callout frameworks, logging frameworks, standard objects, and pick list values and things like that. You might have one that's opportunity automation, that's just for all opportunities in the system. Then you might have one that's for your retail team in particular. So your retail team has their own package and their own place to put their logic within the project structure itself. And then one for the wholesale team. So this will be helpful, and it'll help you set yourselves up and your teams up for future success using second generation packaging. So I definitely recommend taking a look at the SFDX project JSON. The next thing is that you'll see the order, right? Maybe I'll get out of the presentation. Take a look. The order is specified in decimal instead of integer values. That's for a couple reasons. Number one is, if we only had integer values, let's just say I had 10 trigger actions and I wanted to insert one in the middle, then I need to shift all the rest of them down. So there's a little bit of flexibility baked into the order being a decimal to help you alleviate that problem. But also, you could use the order as a team prefix to make sure that all wholesale actions are getting done in one order. And then, so we do all the wholesale things, then we do all the retail things. So then you could use the area to the left of the decimal place as your team prefix, and the numbers to the right as the actual order itself. That should give you the ability to grant up to 1,000 triggered actions per team. So you should be plenty flexible with that. And also just thousands of triggered actions, just so you're aware. The way that this framework works, there's about about a 6 millisecond overhead just to fetch the actions that are configured per DML operation. But if you have cascading DML operations, we 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 uh, we cache those queries, so we don't need to remake them every time. So if I had like uh, an opportunity trigger that updated a parent account, which updated children opportunities, I wouldn't need to requery to fetch the opportunity actions because I already have those cached in memory. So it's about a 6 millisecond overhead time for any new combination of context and S object, but you only need to make it once per transaction. So it's pretty negligible overhead for the flexibility that this grants. You should see very, very minimal performance issues with this. And with that said, yeah, here's an example of how you might be able to use that prefix, right? So maybe prefix 1 is for all opportunity automation, and then maybe prefix 2 is for the wholesale team, and then prefix 3 is for the retail team. But with that, that's my presentation. I want to say thank you guys for showing up today on a Thursday in the middle of the workday. And I'm sorry I was running a little bit late. I'm glad that we were able to get the scratch org issues all figured out. But I'm really excited to share this framework with the world. I think that this could save hundreds, thousands of hours every single year for individual developers. And the impact of this could be big if this gains some traction and folks start to use this to partition their triggers in a much more manageable way, set their future teammates themselves up for success. So thank you guys. If you have any questions, I will gladly stay on for just a minute or two. The easiest way to reach out to me if you have questions on this framework, if you find an issue, just go and submit an issue on GitHub. Otherwise, you can reach out to me on Twitter. Is probably the easiest, at Mitch Spano. I'll put that in the chat right now. So let me know if you start playing with this and you find something that you think is cool, something that could be better. Please let me know. I'm all ears. I really want to just thank you for all of your time, and hopefully you guys think that this is as cool as I do, because I could talk about this for days if you let me.
This is awesome. We absolutely like this feature, and yeah, I can just wait before I try experiment with this one. So this is really a cool presentation. Thank you, Mitch, for that.
Absolutely, thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for reaching out and asking me to do this. It's fun. I like sharing this stuff, and I like the questions. They're great. So thank you.
Yep. And again, as I said at the beginning, like the recording and the presentation will be shared by end of the day today. So again, thank you, Mitch, for all the hard work and all the presentation that you gave. It's really awesome.
Awesome. Thank you guys very much. Have a good afternoon and a great weekend.